Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. I am right here with my good buddy Emil Kalinowski. He is one half, maybe the better half of Making Sense. We won't tell our good friend Jeff Snyder that, but he is definitely the verbose side of the Making Sense podcast partnership. That's for sure. But I wanted to get Emil on here to not only answer some of your questions and take some comments, but also go over some charts that Jeff has outlined in the past, the recent past, which I think are absolutely fascinating, which really juxtapose the consumer price inflation. I want to say that the correct way. The consumer price inflation we saw in the 1940s compared to the consumer price inflation we saw in the 1970s. And I know so many people get confused with Jeff's position on this. And they say, well, how can he say there's no inflation? How can he say there's no inflation? It's, the prices of X, Y, and Z have gone up. Even the consumer price index is at 6.2 or 6.4%. And we all know that that's understated. And they just really, I don't know if Jeff has really had the opportunity to explain his position and put it into terms that just everyone can understand, because he does not define inflation as consumer prices going up. It's more. Go ahead.
No, it's a little bit like money and currency. We use the two interchangeably, but if you want to be specific, if you want to get down to what they really mean, money is something different than currency. Right. Currency should represent money. Money is the real thing, and currency is kind of the nominal representation of money. And the same thing that Jeff is trying to make a point with inflation versus consumer price increases. And he is saying consumer price indices. And notice that they're called consumer price indices, not inflation indices.
Right.
And so we use the terms interchangeably, which is fine almost all of the time. But this might be one of those times when it is not fine, when we need to define specifically what a consumer price increase or decrease is versus inflation or deflation.
And inflation in the money supply, or in the maybe I should say the currency supply, to be very correct. The supply of dollars. And I know Jeff is, and I think you've cited Milton Friedman on numerous occasions. I believe in the early 1960s, where he said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And
yes, I'm sorry for interrupting. Go on, George.
What I'd like to do, Emil, is actually pull up a tweet that Jeff put out the other day that I think illustrates your guys' view very well on the podcast. So let me see. Go to screen share. Okay, so Josh, I can just. Actually, you know what? Let me stop the screen share. Let me redo the screen share, and because I want to.
While you're doing that, let me tell the audience that I love what you're doing, George, because you're doing this combination, the synthesis of YouTube and talk radio, and I'm loving it. I've been a talk radio listener for 30 years, almost 30 years now, and so I know where I'm coming from when I say that what you're doing is talk radio quality, but you're making it something more. You're synthesizing the two worlds, and I'm loving it. I'm loving it on the podcast feed and then on YouTube. So great stuff. Keep it up.
I appreciate thank you, man. I appreciate the kind words. I'm really just throwing everything up against a wall and just seeing what sticks. I wish I could claim it was some clever scheme, but it's really not. It's just trial and error. Okay, so can you see these quotes?
No, it looks as if it was stretched out. It looks like that scene from Interstellar where you're going through the black hole.
Hold on. Let me stop sharing and try this one more time here. Something's not right, obviously. Okay, we'll do a screen share. And then window, entire screen. Okay, let's try that.
Yeah, Jeff and I do a show, a daily, weekly show, actually. It's on podcast and on YouTube, and we talk about the monetary implications and impacts on the economy and society and geopolitics. And then I do a daily. Go on. Yeah, you ready?
Emil, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and then just finish your thought there, because what you've been doing are readings from
Hmm.
other economists, and that's extremely fascinating as well. It's not just the interviews with Jeff.
That's right. So Jeff's show is once a week, and then what are we going to do for the 6 other days? Well, I can't do what you do, which is awesome. So I figured, you know what I'll do? I've got to read all this stuff I'm reading anyway. Why don't I just read it out loud and record it and put it out there? So I've been reading all manner of morsels, sometimes longer, 15, sometimes they're 45 minutes of interesting articles, essays, blog posts by interesting people from geopolitics to the economy and so forth. And it's gone pretty well. Karl Marx made it in there, Adam Smith, Lynn
Lynn Alden.
Alden,
Yeah.
Jeff's presentation at your conference. So lots of good stuff daily. Just, when people are commuting, something for them to listen to.
Absolutely. You got to check it out. And what it's making sense, right? Emil, that's the name of the podcast.
We're thinking of rebranding, George. We're trying
But
to
right
keep up
now,
to
if they
you.
go to iTunes, it's making sense.
Yes.
Eurodollar University. Okay.
Yes. Eurodollar University is the way to find it in the future.
Okay. So now let's go over these quotes. Jeff has got inflation versus inflation, but the first inflation is in quotes here. And this is the Friedman quote I was referring to, where inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. In the case that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. When we talk about output of consumer goods and services or supply. And then he contrasts this with a quote from Alan Greenspan. And this is where it gets very fascinating. As a consequence, while of necessity, it must be the case at the end of the day that inflation has to be a monetary phenomenon. A decision to base policy on measures of money presupposes that we can locate money, and that has become an increasingly dubious proposition. And he is using money there. He basically should use currency or dollars. So basically, what Friedman is saying is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And what Greenspan is saying in 2000 is that, yeah, that's true, but we cannot measure the amount or the quantity of money or currency that is in the system.
Amazing. Stunning. Not the first part. The first part makes sense. Inflation being a monetary phenomenon. But that second sentence where the head of the Federal Reserve, not just any head, but the maestro himself says, I'm a central bank. Presumably my job is to measure the supply and demand of money. And he says, we can't even locate it, which what he's saying is, we don't know how to define the creation, distribution of money, credit, or collateral. It's too much for us. There's so much that's happening. He at one point referred to it as a proliferation of financial products. Not too long ago, right at that time, you know what was becoming money? Asset-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities. They were money good, George. Money good, guaranteed. And they were treated as good as money at the wholesale level. And then eventually we learned that they weren't money good. But that was just one example of many that the financial system had expanded well beyond M2. And he was admitting, but we can't track it. We don't even know how to define money.
Yeah. And then you've got the ledgers between the commercial banks themselves. So I always like to think of dollars, quote unquote, as a liability of either a commercial bank or it's a liability of the Fed. And I'm just using bank reserves denominated in dollars. So you say, okay, are all the dollars that are on the balance sheets of every bank, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, are they all liabilities of the Fed? And the answer there is no. I don't think so. They have dollars that are on their balance sheet that are liabilities of other commercial banks, but it's like they have, I always call it kind of this ghost ledger. And I think Jeff might have said that to begin with, but maybe I borrowed the term from him. But you've got this ledger between banks to where they're extending credit to one another, denominated in dollars, where one bank might send So let's just say Wells Fargo sends Bank of America a liability for $100 million. Let's say someone does a wire transfer. Well, are they backing that up with a corresponding transfer of $100 million in bank reserves? Maybe, maybe not. That the bank that received the liability could just issue a credit for dollars to the bank that gave them the liability in the first place. So are those dollars that have been created? Absolutely. But they are definitely in the shadows. And I think that was Greenspan's point. And that's definitely the point that you guys make on the podcast all the time, where you're looking at M2 money supply. And sure, that does measure something, but it definitely is not indicative of the total amount of dollars or currency that is circulating in the real economy.
And it would seem like, well, okay, let's say that's true. The audience is saying, all right, well, let's grant you that. Then all we have to do to measure money is add up all the balance sheets. And there you go, that's all the money. But there's a gradation on those balance sheets from very liquid and acceptable to not. And how do we apply some sort of factor and then translate that into economic money? And then, George, there's off-balance sheet stuff. The Bank of International Settlements in 2014 came out with a paper that said they found $10 trillion of footnote dollars, debts, liabilities, real money that's actually out there.
Right.
That's not on the balance sheet, but is on page 113 of the Morgan Stanley annual report. So you've got to go through all of those for every bank in the world. And that's,
so those, did they clarify those dollars they were referencing that were not liabilities on the bank's balance sheet, but were there in the form of footnotes? Did they reference whose assets those dollars were? Remember those corporations? Were those, were these like Panama paper people?
Oh, no, not that off balance sheet. It was interbank transactions, deals, promises. That is as good as money. But it's just not on the balance sheet.
So it's that ghost ledger we were talking about, right?
Yeah. So, wow. Now, we're saying how hard it is, but you know what, George? If I had a staff of 1,000 economics PhDs, you can bet that I would put forth a world-class effort to try to measure this money, credit, and collateral.
Right.
But the Federal Reserve and other central banks they're like, I don't know, it doesn't really do it for me. I think what we'll do instead is pop psychology and manage expectations. And that way we'll move around the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go into another chart. This is inflation, so I'm going to minimize this. Hopefully this one works. And all right, can you see that, Emil?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. This is, I don't know if Jeff tweeted this out the other day, but I know this is from his blog. And he goes over the inflation that we had let's be clear here, the consumer price inflation or consumer price increases that we saw in the 1940s compared to the consumer price increases we saw starting in the 1950s and then ramping up to what we saw leading up to like 1980, 81, when Volcker is credited for smashing the inflation, but maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I think there's some debate there that you guys have discussed in your podcast that gets very, very interesting. But my main point here is he's got this red arrow that's saying that this is not inflation, and then a green arrow saying this is inflation. So this would be defining inflation as a significant increase in the overall dollar supply. And that's not just the dollar supply that's on the balance sheet of the non-bank entities in the real economy, i.e. M2, but also, and maybe more importantly, on the balance sheet of these banks, on these ghost ledgers, the dollars that are in the shadows. So I think you guys are saying here with this red arrow that there was no monetary inflation if you look at the dollars in aggregate total, but we did have consumer price increases due to supply shocks, these huge supply shocks. And so although we had the increase in price, this was not inflation. But once we go over the 1950s, now all of a sudden we're seeing the increase in overall dollar supply when you include the ghost ledger and you include M2 money supply. And that's what gave us the sustained levels of real inflation that we saw leading up to the 70s and 1980. Is that a correct assessment of this chart?
Yes, and the word I want to circle and highlight for everyone is sustained.
Yeah.
Sustained.
Yeah.
That's the key that Jeff keeps trying to make. It's a persistent and pervasive, broad economic increase in consumer prices across all goods and services because there's too much money chasing too few goods, or the money is not as valuable. And that is self-reinforcing and perpetuating, and you see it continue. Whereas what we saw in those earlier examples after World War II and during the Korean conflict, what we had was a huge increase in consumer prices.
Bigger
But
in the
was that?
70s.
Yeah, oh, yeah, that's right. That's incredible. So it
Yeah,
was
this
a
chart, I want to point out real
dislocation.
quick. Yeah, I want to point out, Emil, real quick that this, I don't know if people can see my pointer, but right around 1947, Jeff cuts off the chart at 8%. But if my memory serves me right, consumer price inflation as measured by the government was up near 17, 18%. That
Incredible.
1 year, or maybe that year and a half span. And then in 1949, 1950, it actually went negative, to where there was not just disinflation, but for those couple years, we had deflation to the tune of about -2 or -3%.
The world economy was experiencing full body dry heaves, very much like it is right now.
Yeah.
World war, a sudden end to a world war, trying to get back to normal. Can you imagine? And then in 1950, another war. So now we're looking at just the United States, right? And so
Mhm.
this would be the Korean impact and price controls and all that happened during the Korean conflict. But of course, right after the World War, what did we have? We had the government stepping in with price controls, wage controls, financial repression. So you had economic chaos. So, like we are right now. But what we saw was that the system rebalanced and managed somehow to accept these consumer price increases,
Right.
and perhaps real wages were not increasing at that time. And therefore, it wasn't like people said, all right, this banana now costs 5 cents, whereas before it costs a penny, and I can afford that. I'm just going to keep spending as much as I usually did. No, those were tough economic times, and that force an increase in the banana was going to come out of something else. That's
Yeah,
another
right.
point of Jeff's, is that we are in a difficult economic time. And so these price increases are caused by supply and demand imbalances, and they are going to take a bite out of other economic activity, assuming that the supply, that we're not going to see a resolution of these supply demand imbalances.
Yeah. And so what I try to think through is, even if the consumer price increases we've seen in 2020 and 21 are a result of a supply shock, what is the probability of the supply shock continuing if the government policies which created the supply shock extend into the indefinite future? Because I
Yeah,
would argue, back
absolutely.
here in the 40s, we had more, although not perfect, we had more of a free market, to where the cure for high prices were high prices. But
Hmm.
now we're living in a world where, yes, that is true if you have a free market, but if the government steps in and locks everyone in a cage for the next 3 years, you're not going to see that supply shock go away.
I, I would disagree that moment in time was a free market. I would say it wasn't. Immediately after war, during the Depression, financial repression, it was not a free market. There was government involvement everywhere. And as soon as the war ended, you would think they would say, all right, open season, we're opening everything up. But you know how governments are. It took them a long time to start to take their fingers out of the economy and weighing down the scale. So I would say it was similar in a sense to the sort of involvement and lockdowns that we're seeing. The lockdowns are different these days, but I
Right.
think, as Russell Napier often says, we're heading towards an age of financial repression that represented and is very similar to what we saw in the 40s and 50s. George,
Do you want to define that, Emil? Financial repression. I don't think everyone understands what you're saying when you use that term.
financial repression is what the Chinese have been practicing for a very long time, which is in other countries, Japan and Germany, but in China, it's more blunt. And what it is that you are not, you are keeping the rate of inflation above the rate of return. You are not sharing with the households the amount of GDP that they're earning productively. You are
Mm,
keeping them and their savings for other purposes. You don't want them to earn a return or earn their fair share of the economy. And there are good reasons for why this might be. After the Second World War, it was to inflate away the debt slowly. Other
mm,
countries chose to inflate away their debt quickly. France, for example. Other reasons might be we're an undeveloped country, and what we need is we need to take this savings from this household sector and take it from them and invest it into things that we believe will generate economic activity, exports, infrastructure, that sort of thing. So there are good reasons why this is done by various countries around the world. But it's unpleasant for one class of people, George, and those people are called savers.
yeah, or the poor and middle class. Yeah, the wages don't keep up with the rate of inflation. So for the average Joe and Jane, Emil, what I think they're saying, all right, I understand Jeff, I understand Emil. There's some differences in semantics, let's say. But if prices are going up, I don't care if it's a result of a supply shock or additional dollars that are on the ghost ledger between J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs. Uh, I'm still getting pinched. So, what does this? Why does this? Um, why should distinguishing between the 1940s and the 1970s matter to the average Joe and Jane today?
Well, it allows us to know where to look for solutions, for problems, who to blame, what our responses should be. If we believe that this is all being caused by the government handing out stimulus checks or spending like wanton sailors, or because the Federal Reserve is creating money out of thin air with abandon, then
Right.
we won't have our eyes on the real problem, which is our infrastructure, our lack of resiliency in our supply chains, that they're built for efficiency instead of resiliency.
Mm,
It will help us focus our attention on the right problem. But of course, it's awful. And that's what Jeff and I try to acknowledge whenever we talk about this problem. Just because we don't agree that it's inflation doesn't mean that we don't agree that it's a consumer price increase that is hurting Americans and people around the world whose real wages have been stuck for well over a decade, and it's
yeah.
awful and dreadful, and we
Yeah.
hate it.
Yeah, I think if I was trying to give my base case for what it's worth, I think there's a higher probability that we see a 1940s type of scenario play out in the 2020s than a 1970s. And what I mean by now, I don't think that we would have actual negative inflation prints like they had in the late 40s due to a variety of circumstances. But I think that you see these high, levels of inflation for a year or two, and then it crashes down to 2, 3, 4, 5% as measured by the CPI, and then it goes back up, and it's all a result, I think, of the government distortions or how heavily they're distorting the ability for the free market to produce goods and services, and at the same time, how much deficit spending they're doing that is winding up on the asset side of the balance sheet of the non-bank entities. I think that's a big component there. But in order for us to get the 1970s real monetary inflation, I think we'd have to go to a central bank digital currency.
Or here's an alternative: the government, the politicians, think of not just the government, think of the politicians and the millions of registered voters that they want to save. They take control of the private banking system, and they tell Mr. Jamie Dimon, listen, my good friend, we're increasing the regulations like you haven't seen before, and we're dictating to you who you will lend to. And I personally like that you would lend to big employers in my district, or someone else will say, I want you to lend to green companies, and so on and so on. And then someone else will say, I want you to lend to companies that do something with inequality. If you have politicians dipping their beak into the real money creation engine, private banks,
Right.
then I think you could have inflation. And that's what was so disappointing for me after 2020 is they started to do that. They started to do that, George. They started guaranteeing private bank loans to the private economy. And I
Yeah,
thought, this is
PPP.
it.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. They were doing it around the world, George. And I thought, this is it. They finally stumbled upon the solution. Not a wonderful solution. I don't love it, but something to generate money and get it out into the economy. And then they gave up on it. Can you believe it, George? Politicians said, no, I'm not going to be sending money to people that will elect me. I couldn't
Yeah, I
believe
don't
it.
want to buy any more votes.
What? What happened?
I found
Have
religion.
have I been giving them too little credit all these years, George?
Yeah. All right, buddy. Let's go ahead and take some calls and
Oh,
see what we've
wow.
got lined up.
Awesome.
Caller, what is your name?
Hi, my name is Jim.
Hi, Jim. You're on with my good buddy Emil Kalinowski.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm just a regular Joe, just learning the financials that I never knew in my earlier years. I appreciate you guiding the way, George. I went to Rebel Capitalist last go round, and I will be coming again.
All right. Look forward to seeing you in Houston.
And the education has been fantastic. Thank you for your guests and all the information you continue to provide.
All right. Yeah, you're definitely welcome. I appreciate the call. Do you have a comment or question for Emil?
No, I'm just listening and absorbing. Just wanted to, thank you for the information. I love the way he expresses it.
Jim,
Yeah.
where are you calling from? And what are you going to have for Thanksgiving tomorrow?
Virginia, and doing my own thing, so to speak, to help the needy. I don't like to express what I do. It's kind of a secret Santa, but my own kind of thing.
I love it.
Good
God
for you.
bless.
Good
Wonderful.
for you. All right. Thanks for the call.
Thanks, Jim.
All right, caller, you're on with Emil Kalinowski, the one and only.
Hello, George. It's such a dream for me to meet you in person. My name is Jan.
Nice to meet you, Jan.
Yes, I have a question. Another day, I was watching your live stream and I was asking you a question about cryptocurrency, and
Okay.
you kind of got mad. The thing, I know you don't like Shiba Inu, and I want to be very clear. I really don't support the speculative aspect of cryptocurrency. I really see it as a freedom tool,
Okay.
because the power that banks have to create money out of thin air, I believe, is immoral. And cryptocurrency, I believe, is the only solution that we have to regain our power. What and also I listened to Emil uh, uh, talking about the DeFi space and how how he found it interesting. So do you have a comment on that?
Sure. First of all, I'm all about crypto, more specifically Bitcoin, from a standpoint of philosophy. I think that sound money, it would be amazing. I would love it if we had a currency system that would allow the free market to produce actual good deflation, where prices are going down, but we see demand increasing as a result. The economy we have now, if prices are going down, demand goes down with it. And that's where you get this feedback loop that takes this the economy down further and further, this spiral. But yeah, I think from a philosophical standpoint, it's great. And I think the price of Bitcoin is probably the least interesting thing about it. I also love it from a standpoint of it gives you something outside of the banking system as far as purchasing power, because unfortunately, I think we may move into a world where those who value freedom, like we do, are let's just say, excommunicated from the banking system. You know, why do you deserve to have a bank account when you are a dissenting view from the overall narrative that's being pushed by the mainstream media or the central planners? There are no certainties, only probabilities, but I think there's that probability is above zero. And that's the reason why I like Bitcoin. Now, that said, my problem with cryptocurrency overall is that I think it leads people to a conclusion that wealth is gold, or wealth is Bitcoin, or wealth is the amount of dollars that I have in my bank account. Therefore, if I can just buy Shiba Inu at a penny or whatever it is, and it goes up to 10 cents, well, now all of a sudden I'm getting rich. And what I don't like about that is it takes the emphasis off what true wealth is. And true wealth is the ability to create goods and services in a society efficiently. That's the bottom line. And when I was growing up, and I'm sure Emil can attest to this, that the way you and your buddies thought you could get rich is you just had to produce more than you consume. And now with the introduction of NFTs and XYZ cryptocurrency, I think the young people, they've forgotten that that's the way you get rich, is by producing goods and services and giving value to the overall economy and producing something that people value more than the money in their back pocket. And the emphasis has moved into just trading and gambling and speculating. So that's my issue with crypto. And it's not really crypto's fault. I would push that back on the Fed and the incentive structure, because because prices have gone up. It's forced people, either consciously or subconsciously, to go further and further out the risk curve. So I don't, I understand the incentives are there. They're not at fault. I think it's the central planners, but that's kind of my position on it. Emil, I know you've probably given this a lot of thought as well.
Well, Jan, I like what you said, that creating money out of thin air is immoral. I find it distasteful. And immoral is a perfectly reasonable point of view as well. But we live in a fallen world, and we have been creating money out of thin air via the banking system since the Bank of Amsterdam in the early 1600s.
Yeah.
It's just humans, it's what we're going to do. And while I do like a hard currency, hard money, I do prefer that. I wonder if it's acceptable to a modern liberal democracy, because wherever you see, as soon as democracy was broadened out to everyone, when women started to get the vote, everyone in society could vote. And what did we see? We saw a step away from the hard money, because all of a sudden we were no longer concentrating voting power in the aristocracy, in the elite who had hard assets, who don't like inflation. And now all of a sudden you have more of the registered, you have more of the registered voters who are more likely to be in debt. And so a hard currency, we've seen it in Hong Kong, we can see it in Singapore, but those are not liberal democracies. In liberal democracies, I just wonder if it's simply untenable. Because why? Because the hard currency, in order to get the excess out of the system, would be to wring it out of labor.
Right.
Wring it out. Who is another way of saying labor is millions of registered voters. So what politician is going to have the statesmanship or stateswomanship to say, here are my morals, here are my principles, and I'm doing it whether I get voted out of office or not?
Yeah, I always say that perfect money owned or controlled by imperfect human beings will still behave imperfectly. And we'll have to see how it plays out with crypto.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for calling in.
Did you say, where were you calling from, Jan?
Switzerland.
I'm going to visit you as soon as I can. I love it there.
Yes, it's great. I was listening to you, George, from the time you was saying to every host you had that he was your greatest fan. You was saying that every time. I found it funny every time. I was laughing.
Well, it's still true. It's still true. But believe me, every single person I interview, they are huge fanboys of George Gammon.
Yes.
I'm joking there, of course.
It's true.
All right. Go ahead. We got another call here.
It's probably my mother. She's going to call asking me, why haven't I called her? And that she has to call some radio show to get a hold of me. And then she's going to ask me about this and this and this.
All right, caller, what's your name? You're on with Emil Kalinowski.
Hi, I'm Gonzalo, and I'm in Naples, Florida.
Awesome. Oh, I love Naples. Seed to Table, my favorite grocery store of all time.
So I'm a business owner, and we provide outsourcing for small companies, and we've noticed a trend that we are finding admin workers for American companies because they can't find workers. But the reason I started following you, Emilio and George, is because one of my concerns is with the federal government having so much debt, and then the state government having issues with their pensions and the liabilities that they owe. I can see they have a motivation to inflate the currency so they can get rid of all those liabilities for the federal government and the state governments all at once. So that's a concern I have. I'm originally from Argentina, which is the land of hyperinflation. So I saw the same trend happen in Argentina to remove those liabilities from governments. What's your opinions on the government doing that for both the state and the federal level?
Well, I'll go ahead and let Emil start because I think I know what he's going to say. But
I am going to say that the incentives are in alignment exactly as you said, and the central bank have been in charge trying to inflate away our debt, public and private. They have failed miserably. They've been at it for 14 years in the West and 20 in Japan. One day the politicians will get involved. I thought it was going to be in 2020 after that crisis. They didn't. One day voters will put into power people who are aligned with the idea of reducing debt. And most of the voters don't have a lot of savings. Most of them have debt. And why not inflate away that debt? And the government has a lot of debt. So I'm in agreement with you.
So, go ahead, George.
I think that we have to understand that the Fed, just left to their own devices, cannot create inflation. All they can do is increase the size of their balance sheet. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there are more dollars that are circulating in the real economy chasing goods and services. They are dependent upon the commercial banking system to use that, let's just call it additional balance sheet capacity, to create more loans, to create more dollars. So Jerome Powell can sit there and beat his fist on the table all he wants, but unless he has the help of the commercial banks, then he's not going to get the inflation. Unless the government comes in and they start to deficit spend like they did in 2020. And, somehow those treasuries get on the balance sheet of the Fed. So those dollars aren't being extracted from the real economy to begin with. That's going to increase the amount of dollars that are circulating. But again, the Fed can't do that on their own. They are at the mercy of either the politicians, which can't agree on anything, or they're at the mercy of the commercial banking system, where you see them actually producing fewer loans, not greater loans, which makes sense when you look at the balance sheet of the corporations or the balance sheet of the average Joe and Jane. They do have more dollars, but you're trying to lend into an environment that is very, very, let's say, unpredictable. And if you're a bank, are you going to extend a loan, $100 million loan to XYZ business right now, when you know the government could come in a week or two and just do another lockdown, and all of a sudden they're completely bust? That's the position they're in right now. So in that environment, you see less loans going out, and the government has to compensate for that by creating additional dollars any way they can. But again, my main point there is, even though the Fed wants inflation, they can't necessarily get it unless, and this is why I always go back to this, unless they create a central bank digital currency, where now all of a sudden those bank reserves that they can increase, they do have control over the bank reserves denominated in dollars. They can get those circulating in the real economy, like the dollars that are liabilities of the current commercial banking system. So that's kind of my take on it.
Let me ask you, so what would stop, when, March happened, right? I went in and bought a bunch of puts, because when I saw that coming, I was like, oh, this is going to be a great time. And they came in and bought everything up. I see, where most of the state pensions are buying in the S&P and, the safe secured, stocks, right? what would, you know, if they see those values going down, I can see them racing, the Fed coming in and buying everything up to lift up those values of those stocks so they can actually protect those pensions from getting money, which if they were to do that, you know, things go to the moon, right? And then it forces people to go out more in the risk curve. It forces people to take more opportunities. And like here in Cape Coral, I think where you were staying up, 28% of all homes in Cape Coral have been bought by big hedge funds now, right? So all the real estate is being pushed up. So it almost forces local employers to have to pay more, which causes inflation. So I kind of see, and I'm very, you know, uneducated on this thing, but I see if that happens, if the Fed keeps buying, it forces prices to go up to bail out everything else, and businesses will be forced to increase their prices and have to pay more. Which in a way, wouldn't that cause inflation without having the government stepping in if the Fed decides to buy all the assets out there?
Yeah, but I think we're talking about the difference between the 1940s and the 1970s. I think what you just outlined there isn't necessarily monetary inflation, and this gets very, very nuanced, unless the Fed is purchasing those assets from the non-bank entities in the real economy. And that's only looking at M2. That's not looking at the ghost ledger that Emil and I were referencing at the beginning of the video. But if you just look at M2, I think if the central bank is buying those assets from non-bank entities, they would be increasing the supply of M2. But again, I think that goes back to the 1940s. And although we do see these temporary distortions in the economy that would create higher consumer prices, it most likely wouldn't be sustained at the same level as the 1970s. So meaning that over the next 2 years, absolutely, we could see consumer prices go up at, I think, 8, 10, 12%, even as measured by the CPI. But then once they take a break from those policies because they can't agree, or we get in a different Fed chair, what have you, then you see the rate of inflation go back down to maybe, let's say, 4% or 3%. And then the next year comes in, or the next year, let's say we have a big stock crash where they have to send out PPP again and go into a lockdown for climate change. Then you see the spike of inflation or consumer prices going up at the rate of maybe 12%, 15%. And then when they stop, it comes back down. So I think you're right in your observation. But I think, again, that's more the 1940s than it is the 1970s if this plays out for the rest of the 2020s.
Great. Well, George, Emilio, thank you guys for what you do. And being an immigrant to the U.S., I can tell you the reason why, as an immigrant, my family came here is because this is still the land of opportunities. This is still the land of entrepreneurs. And we're not as divided as the media makes us think we are. And at the end of the day, entrepreneurs and free thinkers will actually keep pushing liberty forward. So thank you guys for what you do. Bye-bye.
I agree. Very well said.
Beautiful Thanksgiving message.
Yeah. All right, Emil, I know you've got to walk off to another appointment.
I have my Speedos on underneath here. I'm
You
going
can
to
go
the pool.
swimming.
I'm swimming laps. So this is all professional. And then down here is making economics erotic again, George.
All right, man. Well, I really appreciate you coming in and talking. Your insights are invaluable. I know the audience really got a kick out of it. So for my viewers who want to find out more about what you do, tell them where they can go. Check out the podcast, YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, etc.
Go to eurodollarenterprises.com, and there you will find all the links to all the shows that we do. We do our weekly show with Jeff Snyder, and then the Readings Daily Macro Piece Theater. And you'll also find the David Parkins artwork, where we lampoon what's happening in the monetary world. And these are the best political cartoons available anywhere on Earth at this time. I seriously believe that, George. I'm sorry, George. I just do so many shows with Jeff. I did one with him today. I keep calling you Jeff. Forgive me. The point is Eurodollar Enterprises, and I love you, George. Happy Thanksgiving.
Awesome, buddy. Have a good one. And for the rest of you on this video, enjoy your afternoon. Always stand up and fight for freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. And we'll see you on the